The lost U-47, one of Germany's deadliest submarines, vanished in the Atlantic in 1941 with 45 men aboard. For 70 years, no one knew where it went down. No wreckage, no survivors, just silence. This wasn't just any U-boat. U-47 slipped into Britain's most protected naval base and sank a battleship, killing 835 sailors in 13 minutes. Its commander, Gunther Prien, became Germany's greatest submarine ace. Then, on one cold March night, both the boat and the legend disappeared. British destroyers claimed they sank it. But after the war, historians proved that claim was wrong. They destroyed a different submarine. So what really happened to U-47? And why does its commander's fate still haunt naval history after all these decades? Before we dive in, hit subscribe to honor the untold stories of those who served and were lost at sea. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. May 23, 1941. Across Germany, families gathered around their radios as they did every evening, waiting for news from the front. The war was still young, and for many it still felt like a grand adventure. Victories in France, triumphs in the Atlantic, a sense that Germany was unstoppable. But on this particular evening, the usual confidence in the announcer's voice was gone. Instead, there was something else. Hesitation. Gravity. The kind of tone reserved for losses too significant to ignore. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command, had an announcement to make. It was brief, formal, and devastating. U-47, one of the Kriegsmarine's most celebrated submarines, was officially presumed lost with all hands. Korvettenkapitän Gunther Prien, the commander who had become a household name across the Reich, was gone. 45 men had vanished into the Atlantic, and with them the illusion of invincibility that had surrounded Germany's U-boat fleet. For 2 years, Prien had been untouchable. His face had been on the covers of magazines. His exploits had been turned into propaganda films. Children played games pretending to be him, sneaking past imaginary British defenses in their backyards. He was the hero of Scapa Flow, the man who had humiliated the Royal Navy in their own home waters, the submariner who had proven that no place was safe from German daring. And now, he was simply gone. No dramatic last stand, no final radio message describing a battle to the death. Just silence, the kind of silence that follows a radio transmission that never comes. The kind of silence that stretches from days into weeks, from weeks into months, until hope itself becomes unbearable and families stop waiting by the door. The news rippled through the nation like a shockwave. In Berlin, in Hamburg, in the small villages where U-47's crew had come from, the realization set in slowly, painfully. These were not just names on a list. They were sons and brothers and husbands and fathers. The youngest was barely 19. The oldest was 37. Most were in their early 20s, young men who had joined the Navy with dreams of adventure, of serving their country, of proving themselves in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. None of them had expected to become ghosts. The official story was vague, as official stories often were during wartime. U-47 had been on patrol in the North Atlantic. It had failed to report in. Search efforts had found nothing. The British claimed a probable kill. A destroyer called HMS Wolverine reported attacking a submarine in early March. Depth charges dropped, oil slick observed, target presumed destroyed. But there was no confirmation, no wreckage brought to the surface, no bodies, no debris field that could be identified with certainty. Just an assumption, a best guess, a line in a logbook that said, probable. In war, probable often had to be good enough. But for the families waiting at home, probable was torture. Gunther Prien's wife, Ingeborg, received the telegram on a gray afternoon in Kiel. The words were cold, bureaucratic, designed to convey information without emotion, missing in action, presumed lost. The Navy regrets to inform you. She read it 3 times, each time hoping the words would change, that she had misunderstood, that there was some mistake. But the words remained the same. Her husband, The man who had sailed through impossible defenses and come home a hero had not come home this time. Somewhere in the vast, cold Atlantic, his boat lay on the bottom, and she would never know exactly where. She would never have a grave to visit, never have a place to lay flowers, never have the closure that comes with a body to bury and a ceremony to mark the end. She would spend the rest of her life wondering if, in those final moments, he had thought of her. For 70 years, the ocean kept its secret. Historians would debate. Naval experts would analyze attack reports and cross-reference positions and try to build a timeline that made sense. The British would maintain their claim that Wolverine had sunk U-47, and for decades that would be the accepted version of events. Textbooks would repeat it. Documentaries would dramatize it. The story would be filed away, another casualty of the Battle of the Atlantic, another entry in the long list of ships and submarines that went down in that brutal, grinding war of attrition. But the truth, as it often does, refused to stay buried. Archive photographs tell a story that statistics cannot. 45 faces stare out from old black and white images, young men in their naval uniforms. Some smiling, some serious, all of them impossibly young. The average age of U-47's crew on that final patrol was 22 years old. 22, an age when life should be full of possibilities, of futures yet to be written, of families yet to be started. Instead, their futures ended somewhere in the dark water between Iceland and Scotland in a place no one could pinpoint, in a moment no one witnessed. They became a question mark in the historical record, a mystery that would outlive everyone who had known them. Their commander, Gunther Prien, had never wanted to be a legend. He was not a nobleman or a career officer from a military family. He had been a merchant sailor, a man who worked his way up through competence and determination, who earned his command through skill rather than birthright. His crew respected him because he was good at his job, because he brought them home, because he made decisions based on what would keep them alive rather than what would look impressive in a report. He was uncomfortable with the fame that came after Scapa Flow, uncomfortable with the propaganda machine that turned him into a symbol. He was a submariner, not a showman. He wanted to do his duty and go home to his wife. But duty called him back to sea again, and eventually the sea claimed him. To understand why their disappearance mattered so much, why it became one of the enduring mysteries of the Second World War, we must go back to the beginning. Back to the night one man and one boat changed everything. Back to October 1939, when the war was new and the impossible still seemed possible. Back to Scapa Flow, October 13th, 1939. The Second World War was barely 6 weeks old, and Germany's U-boat fleet was small, untested, and struggling to make an impact against the might of the Royal Navy. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, knew that his submarines were Germany's best hope of strangling Britain's supply lines, but he also knew that the British Navy had centuries of tradition, dozens of battleships and cruisers, and a network of bases that stretched across the globe. If Germany was going to win the war at sea, it would need to do more than sink merchant ships. It would need to strike at the heart of British naval power itself. It would need to do the impossible. Dönitz spread a chart across his desk and pointed to a location in the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland. Scapa Flow, the primary anchorage of the British home fleet, the most heavily defended harbor in the world, and Dönitz wanted to send a submarine inside. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Scapa Flow was surrounded by narrow channels, treacherous currents, anti-submarine nets, patrol boats, and deliberately sunk block ships positioned to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. The Royal Navy had learned its lessons from the First World War when a German U-boat had attempted a similar raid and failed. They had spent 20 years turning Scapa Flow into a fortress. Getting in would require threading a needle in the dark while the tide tried to smash you against the rocks. Getting out would require doing it all again with every alarm in the harbor screaming and every gun turned in your direction. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a suicide mission. But Dönitz did not choose a reasonable, Man, he chose his best. He chose Gunther Prien. At 31 years old, Prien was already recognized as one of the most capable submarine commanders in the Kriegsmarine. But there was nothing in his background that suggested he was destined for greatness. He had not come from military nobility. He had not attended the elite naval academies where Germany's officer class was traditionally bred. He had started as a merchant sailor, working cargo ships and passenger liners, learning seamanship the hard way through long voyages and rough weather. When he joined the Navy, he brought with him a practical, unglamorous competence that his crew appreciated far more than medals or speeches. He was not a fanatic. He was not a Nazi ideologue. He was a professional sailor who understood the sea and respected the men under his command. When Dönitz briefed him on the Scapa Flow mission, Prien studied the charts for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up and said he would do it. U-47 slipped out of Kiel on October 8th, sailing north through the North Sea under cover of darkness. The crew had been told their mission only after they were underway, and when Prien gathered them in the cramped confines of the submarine and explained where they were going, the reaction was mixed. Some men were excited, some were terrified. All of them understood that they might not come back. But they trusted Prien, and that trust was not misplaced. He had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs until he had memorized every rock and channel. He had calculated the tides down to the minute. He had planned every detail of the approach, the attack, and the escape. If it could be done, he would do it. If it could not be done, he would at least give them a fighting chance. On the night of October 13th, U-47 surfaced off the Orkney Islands during a new moon. Visibility was almost zero. The sea was black. The sky was black. The only light came from the faint glow of the aurora borealis dancing across the northern horizon. Prien conned the submarine through Kirk Sound, one of the narrow eastern entrances to Scapa Flow, riding the slack tide when the current was weakest. The channel was barely wide enough. On either side, the hulks of sunken block ships loomed in the darkness, their rusted superstructures jutting above the water like the ribs of dead giants. U-47 scraped along the seabed, the hull groaning, the crew frozen in silence, every man aware that one miscalculation would impale them on the rocks or strand them on a sandbar where the morning light would find them helpless. But Prien's navigation was perfect. Inch by inch, the submarine threaded the needle, and then suddenly they were through. They were inside Scapa Flow. The anchorage was supposed to be full of battleships. Prien had expected to find the pride of the British home fleet lying at anchor, targets so rich that a single spread of torpedoes could change the course of the war. But as U-47 crept forward on the surface, periscope up, Prien realized with sinking dread that the harbor was nearly empty. Most of the fleet was at sea. Only 2 capital ships remained, and one of them was partially obscured behind a merchant vessel. The other was HMS Royal Oak, a First World War-era battleship that had been built in 1914 and was now considered obsolete by modern standards. She was not the prize Prien had hoped for, but she was all he had, and she would have to be enough. At 12:58 a.m. on October 14th, U-47 fired its first spread of torpedoes. 3 weapons launched from the bow tubes, streaking through the dark water toward the sleeping battleship. Only one hit. It struck forward, causing an explosion that rattled the ship, but did not immediately sink her. On board Royal Oak, confusion reigned. The crew thought it was an internal explosion, perhaps a spontaneous detonation in a paint locker or ammunition store. It did not occur to them that a German submarine could possibly be inside Scapa Flow. That was impossible, and so they did not sound the alarm. They did not call the crew to action stations. They did not prepare for a second attack. It was a fatal mistake. Prien reloaded his torpedo tubes in the agonizing minutes that followed. His hands were steady, but inside he was screaming at his crew to move faster, to load faster, to give him another chance before the entire harbor woke up. At 1:16 a.m., he fired again. This time, 3 torpedoes struck home. The explosions tore through Royal Oak's hull, ripping open compartments below the waterline, flooding engine rooms and berthing spaces in seconds. The battleship rolled onto her side and capsized in 13 minutes. 835 men died, many of them teenage cadets who drowned in their hammocks before they even understood what was happening. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in British naval history, and Gunther Prien had just pulled off the most daring submarine raid of the war. U-47 turned and raced back toward Kirk Sound. Behind them, Scapa Flow erupted into chaos. Searchlights swept the water. Guns opened fire at shadows, but it was too late. Prien rode the tide back out the way he had come, scraping over the block ships again, navigating by instinct and memory in the pitch darkness. And then they were clear. They were in open water. They had done the impossible and survived. When U-47 surfaced in the North Sea hours later, the crew erupted in celebration. Prien's first watch officer, Engelbert Endras, sketched a snorting bull on a piece of paper and declared it should be their emblem. The Bull of Scapa Flow. It stuck. When U-47 returned to Germany on October 17th, the reception was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. They were met by Admiral Dönitz himself, by bands playing martial music, by crowds waving flags and shouting themselves hoarse. Adolf Hitler flew to Wilhelmshaven to personally award Prien the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. Overnight, Gunther Prien became a national hero. His image appeared on propaganda posters. His story was told in newsreels. Children recited his name in schools, but the man himself seemed uncomfortable with all of it. He gave the obligatory speeches. He shook the hands thrust at him, but his eyes always drifted back to the sea. He was a submariner. His place was not on a parade ground. His place was on patrol. And that is where he returned again and again, sinking ship after ship, until U-47's tally climbed past 30 Allied vessels destroyed. But the war was changing. The hunters were becoming the hunted. And by early 1941, Gunther Prien knew that every patrol might be his last. February 20th, 1941. U-47 slipped out of the French port of Lorient on what would be its 10th war patrol, disappearing into the gray Atlantic like it had done so many times before. The crew was experienced now, veterans of a brutal campaign that had claimed dozens of Allied merchant ships and earned them a reputation as one of the most effective boats in the fleet. But the war at sea had changed dramatically since those early days when Gunther Prien had sailed into Scapa Flow and emerged a legend. The Atlantic was no longer Germany's hunting ground. It had become a graveyard where U-boats went to die. British defenses had evolved with terrifying speed. Radar could now detect surface submarines in darkness and fog. Depth charges had become more powerful and more accurate. Convoy escorts had learned to work together in coordinated attacks that could pin a submarine down and methodically destroy it. And perhaps most dangerous of all, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had partially cracked the German naval Enigma cipher, which meant that U-boat positions were no longer secret. The British were reading German radio traffic, plotting submarine locations, and routing convoys away from wolfpack concentrations. What had once been an ambush was now often a trap. Prien knew the odds. Every experienced U-boat commander knew them. The average life expectancy of a submarine crew in early 1941 was measured in months, not years. But orders were orders and duty was duty, and so U-47 went to sea one more time. For the first 2 weeks of the patrol, U-47 operated in the North Atlantic southwest of Iceland, searching for convoys in the shipping lanes that stretched between Britain and North America. The weather was brutal, as it always was in those waters during winter. Storms rolled across the ocean in endless succession, waves 30 feet high that sent green water cascading over the conning tower and turned the submarine into a bucking, rolling nightmare for the men inside. Visibility was measured in yards. The cold was so intense that ice formed on every surface, weighing down the boat and making deck work lethal. Men on watch wore every piece of clothing they owned and still shivered until their teeth rattled. Sleep was nearly impossible. Hot food was a luxury. And through it all, the hunt continued. U-47 searched the gray void for targets, listening on hydrophones for the distinctive throb of merchant ship engines, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and scan the horizon, diving at the first sign of aircraft or patrol vessels. It was exhausting, monotonous, and terrifying all at once. And then on March 7, 1941, U-47 sent its last confirmed radio transmission. The message was routine, a position report transmitted in encrypted code to U-boat command headquarters in Lorient. U-47 reported its location south of Iceland and indicated it was continuing its patrol. The radio operator in France acknowledged receipt. The transmission lasted less than a minute, and then U-47 went silent. At first, no one was concerned. Radio silence was standard procedure for U-boats on patrol. Speaking too often gave away your position and invited attack. Days could pass between transmissions, sometimes weeks if a boat was running deep to avoid enemy forces. So when March 8 came and went without word from U-47, headquarters assumed Prien was simply maintaining operational security. When March 9 passed in silence, they began to wonder. By March 10th, concern was growing. By March 15th, it had turned to dread. U-boat command sent repeated requests for U-47 to report in. The radio waves carried their coded messages into the void. No response came back. On March 23, 1941, U-47 was officially listed as overdue. The word carried a weight that everyone in the U-boat service understood. Overdue meant missing. It meant that all attempts to make contact had failed. It meant that the submarine had either been sunk or was so badly damaged that it could not communicate. In rare cases, it meant the boat was limping home on the surface, its radios destroyed, surviving on luck and seamanship alone. But those cases were exceptions. Most boats listed as overdue never came home. The days stretched into weeks. Families waited by their radios and checked their mailboxes with desperate hope, clinging to the possibility that their sons and husbands and fathers were prisoners of war, that the British had captured them and just hadn't announced it yet. But as April arrived and then May, hope became harder to sustain. The sea had taken U-47. Everyone knew it. The only question was how. On May 23, 1941, the announcement was finally made. U-47 and all 45 men aboard were presumed lost with all hands. The news devastated Germany. Gunther Prien had been more than just a successful commander. He had been a symbol, proof that German courage and skill could overcome any obstacle. His disappearance felt like a fundamental shift in the war, a sign that the tide was turning against the Reich. But for the families of the crew, the announcement brought no closure. There was no wreck to visit, no bodies to bury, no final resting place where grief could be properly expressed. Just a vast, empty ocean and a single word that would haunt them for decades. Missing. The British had an answer, or at least they claimed to. According to Royal Navy records, on the night of March 7th and into the early hours of March 8, 1941, the destroyers HMS Wolverine and HMS Verity had been escorting convoy OB-293 when their ASDIC operators detected a submarine contact. The two destroyers broke away from the convoy and began a systematic hunt, dropping depth charges in a grid pattern designed to force the submarine to the surface. After several hours of attacks, Wolverine reported a kill. The ASDIC contact had disappeared. An oil slick had spread across the surface. There were no further signs of the submarine. The commanding officer of HMS Wolverine, Commander James Rowland, filed a report claiming a probable U-boat destruction. For decades, this report was accepted as fact. The history books recorded that U-47 had been sunk by HMS Wolverine on March 8, 1941. The mystery appeared to be solved. Gunther Prien and his crew had gone down fighting, destroyed by British depth charges in the cold waters south of Iceland. It was a clean narrative. It provided closure, and it was completely wrong. The truth began to unravel in the years after the war when historians gained access to German naval archives that had survived the collapse of the Third Reich. Among the documents was the war diary of U-A, another German submarine that had been operating in the same area at the same time as U-47. According to UA's own records, it had been attacked by British destroyers on the night of March 78 while defending against convoy OB-293. The attack had been intense and prolonged. Depth charges had damaged the submarine's hull and forced it to dive deep, but UA had survived. It had limped back to France, arriving in port weeks later with a shaken crew and a battered hull that required extensive repairs. The submarine that HMS Wolverine had attacked was not U-47. It was UA. The official British claim was based on a misidentification. Commander Rowland had been right that he hit a submarine, but he had been wrong about which one. And more importantly, he had been wrong about sinking it. The probable kill was neither probable nor a kill. It was a damaged boat that got away. This discovery should have solved the mystery of U-47 by eliminating a false lead, but instead it made everything worse. If Wolverine had not sunk U-47, then what had? Researchers began combing through every Allied attack report from early March 1941, searching for another engagement that might account for Prien's submarine. They found nothing definitive. There were other depth charge attacks. There were aircraft that dropped bombs on suspected contacts. There were mines scattered across U-boat transit routes. But none of the claims could be conclusively linked to U-47. The submarine had simply vanished somewhere between its last radio transmission on March 7th and its failure to return home in the weeks that followed. 45 men and one of Germany's most famous boats had disappeared into the Atlantic without a trace, and 70 years later no one could say with certainty what had killed them. The theories multiplied in the absence of evidence. Some historians believed U-47 struck a mine, a random encounter with an explosive device that would have detonated without warning and sent the submarine to the bottom in seconds. Others suggested mechanical failure, perhaps a catastrophic flooding incident, or a jam in the diving planes that sent the boat into an uncontrolled dive past its crushed depth. Still others raised the possibility of a circular run, where one of U-47's own torpedoes malfunctioned and came back to strike the submarine that launched it, a documented phenomenon that had killed other boats. And some simply accepted that the answer might be lost forever, that the sea had claimed U-47 in one of 1,000 ways that left no witnesses and no evidence. Without a wreck, all theories were equal. All theories were speculation. The only certainty was that somewhere in the North Atlantic, beneath thousands of feet of black water, U-47 and her crew were still on patrol. The search for U-47 did not take place in the waters of the North Atlantic with sonar and submersibles scanning the ocean floor. It took place in archives and libraries, in dusty file boxes containing decades-old documents, in the meticulous cross-referencing of war diaries and attack reports and radio logs that had been scattered across museums and government repositories in half a dozen countries. The hunt for Gunther Prien's submarine became a paper chase, pursued not by salvage crews but by a dedicated community of naval historians who refused to accept the official narrative that had been repeated for so long it had calcified into accepted fact. Chief among these investigators was Axel Niesle, a German researcher who spent years of his life reconstructing the final weeks of U-47's existence from fragmentary evidence that had been gathering dust since 1945. Niesle's work was painstaking and unglamorous, the kind of historical detective work that required infinite patience and an obsessive attention to detail. He compared British attack logs against German U-boat movement records looking for discrepancies. He tracked down survivors from Allied warships and interviewed them about engagements they could barely remember. He analyzed weather reports and tidal charts and operational orders, building a timeline that accounted for every submarine operating in the North Atlantic during the first 2 weeks of March 1941. And slowly, methodically, he dismantled the myth that HMS Wolverine had sunk U-47. The breakthrough came when Niesle obtained access to the war diary of UA, the submarine that had actually been attacked by Wolverine on the night of March 7-8. The diary was detailed and explicit. It described the detection by British destroyers, the hours-long depth charge attack that had damaged the boat's pressure hull, the emergency dive that had taken UA far below its recommended operating depth, and the harrowing escape that had left the crew shaken but alive. The diary even noted the date and time of the attack, which matched precisely with Wolverine's own report. There was no ambiguity. UA had been the target, and UA had survived. Commander Rowland's probable kill claim was based on a mistaken assumption that the submarine had been destroyed when in fact it had simply broken contact and fled. For decades, this error had been accepted as historical truth, repeated in book after book, documentary after documentary, until it became impossible to question. But Nislé's research proved definitively that the official story was wrong. U-47 had not been sunk by HMS Wolverine. The mystery was not solved. It was reset to zero. The revelation should have sparked a renewed investigation into alternative explanations for U-47's loss. But what Nislé discovered instead was a void. Once the Wolverine claim was eliminated, there were no other credible candidates. He examined every reported submarine attack in the relevant time frame and geographic area. He cross-referenced positions where British forces claimed U-boat kills with the known locations of German submarines that had survived. He looked at aircraft patrol reports, mine-laying operations, and convoy defense actions. Nothing matched. There were attacks on submarines, certainly, but they could all be accounted for by boats that had either escaped or whose losses could be attributed to other engagements with clear evidence. U-47 had not been sunk in a dramatic battle. It had not been caught on the surface by an aircraft. It had not triggered a mine in a known defensive field where wreckage might be expected. It had simply ceased to exist somewhere between its last radio transmission and the date it was declared overdue, and the historical record offered no explanation for how or why. The most likely scenarios, Nislé concluded, were the ones that left no trace. A mine strike in the open ocean far from charted minefields where a lone drifting explosive had intersected U-47's path by random chance. A catastrophic mechanical failure, perhaps a ruptured pressure hull or a jammed diving plane that sent the submarine into an uncontrolled descent beyond its crush depth. A circular torpedo run where one of U-47's own weapons malfunctioned and circled back to strike the boat that fired it. An internal explosion, possibly from a fuel leak or battery gas buildup that detonated without warning. All of these were documented ways that submarines died, and all of them shared a common characteristic. They happened without witnesses. They left no survivors to report what went wrong. They sent boats to the bottom so quickly that there was no time for a distress signal, no time to surface, no time to abandon ship. And they were, by their very nature, impossible to prove or disprove without finding the wreck itself. The ocean floor would hold the answer, but the ocean floor was vast and deep and had kept its secrets for 70 years with no sign of giving them up. For Nislé and the other historians who had devoted years to solving the mystery of U-47, the conclusion of their research was not triumphant. It was profoundly frustrating. They had succeeded in demolishing the false narrative, in proving that the accepted explanation was wrong, but they had not succeeded in replacing it with the truth. The paper trail ended in uncertainty. The archival evidence led to a dead end. All they could say with confidence was what had not happened to U-47. What had actually happened remained as mysterious as it had been on the day the submarine failed to return. The families who had waited decades for answers were told in effect that there were no answers to be found in the historical record. The only remaining witness was the wreck itself, and the wreck was somewhere in the North Atlantic, lying in darkness at a depth that made recovery impossible even if it could be located. The investigation had reached its limit. The truth was down there, entombed in steel and coral and silt, beyond the reach of historians armed with nothing but documents and determination. The emotional weight of this realization cannot be overstated. For the descendants of U-47's crew, the collapse of the official story meant that the one piece of certainty they had clung to for decades was revealed as fiction. Their fathers and grandfathers had not gone down in a battle with HMS Wolverine. They had not died in a documented engagement where their courage could be recognized and their sacrifice could be understood in the context of military action. They had simply vanished, and no one could say why. The not knowing, which had always been painful, became total. There was no narrative to provide structure to their grief, no enemy to acknowledge their loss, No moment of death that could be marked on a calendar or located on a map. Just an absence that stretched from March 1941 to the present day, unbroken and unexplained. Some families found this unbearable. Others found a strange comfort in it, a sense that their loved ones had been claimed by the sea itself rather than by human violence, that they rested now in a place beyond war and politics and national allegiances. But all of them shared a common question that haunted them across generations. What happened in those final moments? Did the crew know they were dying, or did death come so fast that there was no time for fear? Was there a struggle to save the boat, or did it simply disappear between one breath and the next? The historical record was silent. The ocean was silent. And the 45 men who knew the answer were silent too. The investigation into U-47's fate did not end with Nislé's work, but it did reach a conclusion of sorts. The paper chase had gone as far as it could go. Every document had been examined. Every cross-reference had been checked. Every theory had been tested against the available evidence. And at the end of all that effort, the only honest answer was the hardest one to accept. We do not know. We may never know. The search for U-47 would have to move from the archives to the ocean itself, and the ocean is a far less forgiving place to conduct research than a library. Without a specific location to search, without even a rough area where the wreck might be expected, the task of finding U-47 was not difficult. It was impossible. The North Atlantic is millions of square miles of cold, deep water. The submarine could be anywhere. And even if, by some miracle, it were found, what would it tell us? Would the wreck reveal the cause of the loss, or would it simply confirm what historians already knew, that U-47 went down and never came up? The mystery would persist even in discovery, because some questions cannot be answered by finding the wreckage. Some questions died with the crew, and Gunther Prien, the man who had once seemed invincible, the hero who had sailed into the impossible and emerged victorious, had taken the final secret of U-47 with him to a grave that had no marker and no location. All that remained was memory and questions and the knowledge that somewhere beneath the waves, the bull of Scapa Flow was still on patrol. The story of U-47 is not a story about good and evil, though it has been told that way by propagandists on both sides for more than 80 years. It is a story about men in the sea, about duty and sacrifice, about the brutal arithmetic of war where young lives are spent like currency in pursuit of strategic objectives that most of those young men barely understood. The crew of U-47 were sailors following orders in a conflict they did not start and could not stop. Their victims, the 835 men who died aboard HMS Royal Oak, were equally doing their duty, equally following orders, equally caught in the machinery of a war that ground up human beings with industrial efficiency. There is no moral superiority to be claimed by either side when the final accounting is made. The sea does not care about politics or nationalism or which flag a ship flies. The sea takes everyone with the same indifference, and it holds them all in the same cold embrace. In Scapa Flow, the wreck of HMS Royal Oak remains where it sank, a designated war grave protected by law and respected by divers who know that disturbing it would be an act of desecration. Every year on the anniversary of the sinking, the Royal Navy holds a ceremony of remembrance. A diver descends to the wreck and places a white ensign on the hull, a gesture that acknowledges the 835 souls who rest there and ensures they are not forgotten. For the families of those men, there is a place to grieve. There is a location marked on charts. There is a ritual that honors the dead and gives structure to loss. For the families of U-47's crew, there is none of that. Their grave is the entire North Atlantic, a space so vast and featureless that grief has nowhere to anchor itself. In Germany, the descendants of U-47's crew have lived for decades with a unique kind of sorrow, one that lacks closure and resists healing. One woman, the daughter of a U-47 crewman who was barely 2 years old when her father sailed away and never returned, spoke about her experience in an interview conducted in the early 2000s when she was in her 60s. She said that for 70 years she had not known where her father was, and that she still did not know, and that the not knowing was the hardest part. It was not just that he was dead, though that was painful enough. It was that he had no resting place, no grave she could visit on his birthday or on the anniversary of his loss, no stone marker where she could leave flowers and feel connected to his memory. He was somewhere in the ocean, but the ocean was everywhere and nowhere at once. She had spent her entire life grieving a man she barely remembered, a man whose absence had shaped her childhood and whose disappearance had left a void that could never be filled because it could never be defined. How do you mourn someone who has no grave? How do you say goodbye when there is no place to go to feel close to them? These questions haunted her, and they haunted hundreds of other family members who carried the same burden across generations. In Britain, the descendants and survivors of the Royal Oak sinking have shown a remarkable willingness to acknowledge the shared tragedy that connects them to the families of U-47. At naval remembrance events where veterans from both sides gather to honor the dead, there is a recognition that the sea claimed sailors from every nation, that courage was not exclusive to any flag, and that the young men who died in submarines and on battleships were more alike than different. One British veteran who survived the sinking of Royal Oak said in an interview that Prien and his crew were brave men, just like the British sailors who died that night. They were all doing their jobs in a war that asked terrible things of them. The sea took them all eventually, and in death there are no enemies, only sailors who will never come home. This sentiment, expressed by a man who had every reason to hate Gunther Prien, reflects a deeper truth about war that is often obscured by nationalism and propaganda. The men who fight are not the men who decide. They are instruments of policy, expendable assets deployed by governments that calculate losses in percentages and acceptable casualties. To honor the dead is to recognize their humanity, regardless of which side they served. The true memorial to U-47 and its crew is not a physical monument, though several have been erected in Germany over the years. It is found in the continued search for understanding, in the work of historians like Axel Niestle, who refuse to let propaganda masquerade as truth, in the quiet respect shown between former enemies at remembrance ceremonies where old men in uniform stand together and acknowledge that they all served, they all suffered, and they all lost friends to the sea. It is found in the recognition that Gunther Prien was not a cartoon villain or a propaganda hero, but a skilled submarine commander who did his duty with competence and courage until the sea claimed him. It is found in the acknowledgement that the 45 men who sailed with him on that final patrol were sons and brothers and husbands who died far from home in a war they did not start, and that their sacrifice, whether one agrees with the cause they served or not, was real and permanent and worthy of being remembered. The ocean is their monument, vast and eternal, and every wave that rolls across the North Atlantic is a marker for the thousands of sailors from every nation who rest beneath its surface. 80 years is a long time to wait for answers that may never come. For some families, the passage of time has brought a measure of peace, an acceptance that the mystery of U-47's fate is part of the story itself, that not every question has an answer, and that some losses must be carried without resolution. For others, the search continues, not in the literal sense of expeditions and sonar scans, but in the quieter work of keeping memory alive, of ensuring that the men who sailed on U-47 are not reduced to statistics or forgotten in the vast catalog of wartime casualties. Their names are known. Their faces are preserved in photographs. Their service is documented in the records that survived the war. They are not anonymous. They are not forgotten. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the true measure of remembrance is not in finding the wreck or solving the mystery, but in ensuring that future generations know these men existed, that they mattered, that their lives and deaths were part of a larger story about the cost of war and the indifference of the sea. Whether Gunther Prien was a hero or a villain depends entirely on which side of history one stands. To the families of HMS Royal Oak's crew, he was the man who killed their fathers and grandfathers in a surprise attack that gave them no chance to fight back. To the families of U-47's crew, he was a dedicated commander who brought his men home safely on 9 patrols before the sea finally claimed them all on the 10th. Both perspectives are valid. Both contain truth, and both are ultimately inadequate to capture the complexity of a man who was neither saint nor demon, but a professional sailor doing his job in a war that demanded everything and gave nothing back. The sea does not judge. It does not take sides. It claims the brave and the cowardly alike, the victors and the vanquished, the famous and the forgotten. In the end, Gunther, Prien, and his crew rest in the same cold darkness as the men they killed aboard Royal Oak, all of them sailors, all of them lost, all of them equal in death. Their graves are unmarked because the ocean does not mark graves. It simply holds them, as it has held sailors since the first ships ventured beyond sight of land, and as it will continue to hold them long after the wars they fought in are forgotten and the nations they served have turned to dust. The waves roll on, indifferent and eternal, and beneath them U-47 lies in the dark, still on patrol, forever.